Good afternoon and welcome to the Elections and Human Rights Discussion Series organized by the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia. My name is Christina Eberbach and I'm Deputy Director of the Institute. And I'm also a steering committee member of our co-organizer today, the University and College Consortium for Human Rights Education. Today's discussion is entitled Human Rights Classrooms and Elections, Teaching the Day After. It is co-sponsored by Columbia Votes, Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute, Social Work Votes, CIFA's Human Rights and Humanitarian Policy Program, and University of Connecticut's Nancy Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work. During this event, human rights educators will discuss how they plan to address anticipated challenges and opportunities with respect to teaching after the 2020 US elections. We will also ask them to share techniques for ensuring an inclusive and respectful environment around teaching and discussing contentious issues. We will then open it up for discussion. We would like to record this event and share it later, so if you don't feel comfortable having your video shared, please feel free to turn it off. Before we begin, we'd also invite you to introduce yourself via the chat function. And you can also feel free to add questions in the chat as well. Joining us today as panelists are Natalie Hudson, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and Director of the Human Rights Program at the University of Dayton, Kendall Thomas, a Nash Professor of Law and Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture at Columbia University, and Rachel Wahl, Associate Professor in the Social Foundations Program at the Department of Leadership, Foundations, and Policy at the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia. Joining us as moderator is Sandra Sirota, a Post-Doctoral Fellow at the Human Rights Institute at the University of Connecticut, and she is also a member of the UCCHRE Steering Committee. Sandra, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. We're really excited for this dynamic and impressive lineup of panelists that we're going to hear from. So we'll be posing some questions, and I'll ask the panelists to just feel free to speak in any order you like, or I'll ask someone to speak if people are shy, but I doubt that with this group. And then after a few questions, probably about halfway through, we'll open it up to questions and comments, thoughts from all of you. So we're really excited for all you to be here, and I think we'll just dive in. So to start, we wanted to ask you to reflect back a little bit and share a story or an experience of teaching human rights in a contentious environment, and how you either learned from that if it didn't go very well, or how you found yourself to be successful, and maybe there are some things from that that we could all learn.
I'm happy to go first. Thank you, Sandra. Before I start with answering that question, I just want to thank the organizers for the opportunity really to think more about this and reflect. I said at the opening that it was really nice to have a reason to sharpen my thoughts around what I will do in November after the election, and really more what am I doing now to prep my class for difficult discussions, and I can talk more about that. And I think in terms of, before I share maybe my experience, it's really important to recognize my positionality in my classroom and the kinds of classes that I teach. I teach human rights students who major or minor in human rights and also international studies and political science. And so I have a particular group of students that are passionate about these issues and attracted to these issues. And I imagine that the conversations and strategies that work in this space don't always translate into more general classes that non-majors take in politics, or for example. I also think my personhood in terms of being a white woman who's tenured, who's able-bodied, middle-aged, all of these things affect how the work that I do in the classroom is received, and the kind of power dynamics that are at place. And so I think those are also things we really need to recognize as we think about facilitating difficult dialogue. The example that I'll share briefly was shortly after Charlottesville, and I was teaching a politics of human rights class, and it was clear that for some of my students, even though of course, race has long been an issue, this was hitting very close to home in terms of human rights dynamics in this space. And so what I did in that class shortly following those events of that late summer was to start the class with a writing reflection. I think, you know, learning through writing is a really powerful technique. And I really encourage students to use 5 minutes to sort of do a brain dump in terms of reflecting and not worrying about grammar or coherency, but really trying to take everything that's going on in their head around this particular issue and just write it down. And this is sort of a balance between what they experience, what they know, right, and how they feel about it, and sort of trying to push them to think about those two things. And using that as a space to sort of put some things down before entering into a conversation. And I think that really helps students in sort of picking out what they want to say and what they don't. And then at the end of class, I had them reflect again on the class, on what they wanted to say and they didn't, what they heard that they hadn't heard before, and what challenged them, what they didn't agree with. And so it also enabled a space then at the end to sort of debrief and reflect. And I think using sort of writing as bookends in a class space can help diffuse some of the tension, but also help organize thoughts for students. And I think it can be really powerful. So I could imagine for, you know, those days after the election, I think that's going to be really different too, right? In terms of teaching the day after the election, we also have to think about teaching the weeks after the election in ways that I don't think we've ever had to sort of grapple with, right? Because we won't have the results most likely in the day or 2 days after. So I could imagine a writing exercise in this case, asking students to, you know, to reflect on what was the most impactful or striking experience of the election for them thus far. So starting class with that, or what is your biggest concern or challenge right now, right, in 2 days or 1 day after the election, and why? And then of course at the end, going back to that question, what was one thing you heard today that you didn't hear before, or what did you say that you didn't want to say? So I'll pause there. I'd love to hear what my other panelists have in mind, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you. I really appreciated what you said about what they wanted to say, but they didn't. I think that's something that's important to think about, right? And have a chance to write down if they didn't get to say it. Rachel or Kendall?
I'm happy to speak or wait, depending on your preference.
Please.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie. I really enjoyed hearing from you. I'm in Charlottesville and was here during August 12th of 2017. And so I was also thinking about teaching the day after, or the few days after that, the weeks after that, as well as the day after and the weeks after the 2016 election, which I'm sure is very much on everyone's mind as we think about what the classroom was like and will be like on that day. And in general, the lessons that I took from that in my own teaching, not just from the direct experience of it, but from anonymous evaluations afterward and from reading reflections that students wrote in general, not just in Charlottesville, but across the country about how their faculty responded the day after the election, was first not to, as far as possible, make assumptions about what students are experiencing. Mm-hmm. And I think this can be very difficult because I think particularly when we're teaching human rights courses or courses that deal with social justice issues, there's a temptation to assume that we have some kind of shared understanding, some kind of shared consensus that is going to create the basis for a conversation that can be perhaps more open than we might be in a different kind of course. But I was reminded just this week in an interview that I happened to conduct. I do research on political dialogue, and I had interviewed university students who voted for Trump and who voted for Clinton. In 2016, I interviewed them after a dialogue event that they attended with each other in 2017. And this week, I started re-interviewing those students 3 years later. And I was interviewing one student a few days ago who is a student of color, very committed to issues of racial justice, has been doing a lot of really serious thinking about white privilege and its implications, thinking about the story of her parents who immigrated to this country. We had a long interview about these issues. And then near the end of the interview, started talking about the election, and she shared that she planned to vote for Trump. So it was really a reminder to me that when we teach the day after the election and the weeks after the election, we can't assume we know where our students are. So I think first for me, I'll aim to create space I'll aim to open up a space that makes as few assumptions as possible for where people are and what people need. Of course, what we do is going to depend on what is happening and the extent and nature of instability that we might be experiencing, the extent to which that insecurity feels physical as opposed to only existential. And I don't mean that to diminish the existential nature of insecurity, but it might also feel very directly physical. So trying to check in with what people need. And then I really appreciated, Natalie, your suggestion of offering the modality of writing, because I had been thinking the same, that it might be helpful to offer students the option of breaking out into small groups to talk to others or to write on their own. And I was thinking it might be helpful to have students, some students might really want to talk to some peers, and some students might just need some time for reflection. So having a different modalities that they might pursue for that. And then coming back together and checking in with whether or not and how people want to share what they've written about or spoken about, to take the temperature of the room and see what people are willing to and wanting to go into in the class setting. The other thing that I heard after the Charlottesville riot and after the 2016 election from students is that they really appreciated it when professors could tie in what was happening to the class content, not only because that made the class content more meaningful, but also because it gave them a focused way to engage. Students often felt like they were coming in just overwhelmed, and sometimes some students really appreciated the chance to just say, here's your space, you can use it as you wish. Some students felt like, I need something to go with. I need something, a ground to stand on in order to even open my mouth right now because I'm feeling so overwhelmed. So being able to really concretely tie it into the class content. And of course, for people who are teaching a human rights class, that will be not a challenge to make that tie-in. And I also think that the framework of human rights can create a common ground of conversation that isn't about whether or not we hate Trump, but is about the concrete implications of whatever is happening for human rights, policies, norms, values, actions, which is more concrete than, is Trump a monster? So I think that I would open up a conversation about two things. One would be the human rights implication of what is actually happening. Is the election being contested? Are the results being accepted? What is the process for making that determination? What is the role of the Supreme Court, et cetera? So the human rights implications of what is happening with that process of the election. And then also the human rights implications of what is happening with the potential or known election results. So what will a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency likely mean for human rights policies and practices? And then finally, I would anticipate that students will have a pretty acute desire for information. They'll probably have a lot of questions like, what's going to happen next, and how is it going to be decided, and who has control over this and that. They'll have, I'm guessing, a lot of questions about process, and I'm guessing that I will probably not have all of those answers. Perhaps nobody will, but perhaps some people other than myself will. So I think I would want to be prepared to have a focused conversation on evaluating sources and pursuing information, rather than on being able to answer all questions myself. And to that end, I might think about compiling a list of questions that are foremost on students' minds, and perhaps assigning student groups to research those over time, over the course of several weeks, with guidance from me on how to pursue that research with trustworthy sources. So those would be my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Rachel. A lot of excellent ideas there that I'm writing down. Kendall.
First, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I must say, I've already learned much more from what I've heard than I can possibly hope to contribute to the conversation. But I want to maybe start by sharing a story about the class I was teaching 4 years ago, the day after the last presidential election.
Mm.
And it was a class I was co-teaching with a graduate of the law school who also happens to be my former student, Miriam Perez, who's at the Brennan Center and who specializes on voting rights and election law. And she'd been very busy the entire semester. And we had brought into the classroom, which was a course on civil rights lawyering in the modern era, which was framed in part by questions of human rights. We brought those issues into the classroom all semester because she was flying all over the country. There was litigation, I recall, in Texas in particular. So we had spent the semester talking about the work that one of the instructors was doing on the ground. So the question of the electoral process, and in particular, the legal issues and conflicts that emerged in the months leading up to the election were very present in the students' mind. But what I remember most is what it felt like to watch my students over the course of the 2 hours of the seminar, discussing the materials we'd assigned for that day, and unable to see their computer screen through the tears that they were shedding, right? Because overnight, the aspirations and expectations that many of them had worked their whole lives, and certainly in law school, to avail themselves of, were shattered. And so the lesson of that for me was, and it's a particularly important lesson, I think, when many of us are gathering weekly and sometimes 2-3 times a week with students in a virtual space that's part of a digital campus, is that education is a human experience. Mm-hmm. And that those of us in particular who are doing work in the classroom on human rights can cultivate a mindfulness of the human dimensions and the human foundations of learning and coming together in learning communities. So that would be a kind of ethical orientation that I think is available to those of us who do human rights curriculum. The other thing I would say, though, and I didn't want to lead with this because I didn't want to come into this conversation and drop a stink bomb, but there's a part of me that wants to reject the premise that somehow, and this is implicit, I think, in the story I've just told you, that somehow we need to pivot from the kind of teaching we have been doing to a different kind of teaching. And I think that gives a power and accords a pride of place, not just to elections, but to this election. Right? I don't remember a panel like this in 2016. Right? Then we would accord to other events. Right? So I'm thinking, for example, about the ways in which many of the issues that we're putting on the table and exploring here were also nested in the impact on our intellectual communities and on our human rights teaching of the George Floyd incident, or the Breonna Taylor incident, or the Michael Brown incident, and I speak as a law professor, particularly the decisions by the grand juries not to return bills of indictment of the police officers who killed Michael Brown or Eric Garner. The same kind of shattering was experienced by a segment of our community that typically is expected, in the words of one of my colleagues, just to suck it up, right? Because the everyday life of the law for them is one in which violence is routine, recurring, and normalized in ways that we often ignore. Right? So I think the continuities between the contested and conflicted contexts in which, as a law professor, I am discussing, say, human rights with respect to the election, politics, voting rights, the denial of voting rights and the like, cannot be divorced from these other moments. That said, one exercise I plan to do in the course in human rights and the question of culture that I'm teaching this semester is to ask the students to spend some time writing, since I've also found it's a very effective way for students to organize their thoughts, put their thoughts down, and then share them in a way that empowers them. It's 2024. So reflect on what the young lawyer, since most of them will have graduated, all of them will have graduated, what the young lawyer you will be in 2024 will tell the law student that you are in 2020 about the work you did to contribute to and maintain the culture of human rights and rule of law culture. Right? What's your ethical obligation? What's your intellectual obligation? What's your political obligation? Right? To make a contribution to the maintenance of rule of law and human rights culture. Those, it seems to me, are questions that are directly relevant to the subject matter of the courses and engage the students in the work of analysis and critical inquiry, which it is my job to offer to them, right? So that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Kendall. I really appreciate everything you had to say, and particularly that you dropped the stink bomb, so to speak, because I think, you know, as you talked about in 2016 being, you know, the day after, and the tears, like knowing that human rights are emotional and personal, and that whenever we teach, we can assume that someone in the room is directly experiencing the human rights violations that we're talking about, right? So I really appreciated that perspective. Considering the time, I thought maybe I would ask each of the panelists just to give a 1 or 2 minute reply to each other. We had other questions about challenges and opportunities in teaching human rights after the election, but I think you've touched on that, or you could address it now. And also techniques for ensuring an inclusive, respectful environment about teaching and discussing contentious issues. So if you just want to take a minute or two to respond to each other or address one of those questions, and then we could open it up to everyone else.
Well, I'll start. I appreciate very much, Rachel and Kendall, what you've noted here. I think part of this continuity that Kendall sort of brought up is this idea of what are we already doing in our classrooms that create spaces that are safe, right? That make as few assumptions as possible, as Rachel said, but that also sort of push our students with being uncomfortable and being able to operate in sort of difficult dialogue spaces. So what are we doing now around other issues that that can create that sort of safe space, respectful, right? And those are simple things oftentimes in terms of setting ground rules for civic, civil dialogue in the classroom, how we operate in terms of letting people speak and that sort of thing. I also think it's a challenge in terms of, or one of the challenges that I see as I approach this is thinking about sort of my own place in that classroom and creating a space. And I try to create a space where, we shift the power dynamics and we think about, not my power over students as professor, but power through and with students. And that's also a place if you're trying to really connect with students, which is increasingly difficult online, where you have, which I think requires a certain level of vulnerability on the part of the instructor. And so figuring out that balance of sort of being fully present and trying to connect on that very human level, as Kendall mentioned, and creating that space where students feel like they can reflect in honest ways about their experiences.
Thank you. Rachel?
I think I'll just say that I really appreciated Professor Thomas's point about what is considered a disruption, that we need to be thoughtful about what we signal to our students when we say, okay, everything that's on the syllabus needs to stop because of this, and what we signal to our students when we just continue on. And I just want to mark the salience of that point.
Thank you. Kendall?
Well, I have a very specific vision of what my role in a classroom is. And in recent years, I've actually taken to putting it on the syllabus. I say that I see my job as a law professor to create a classroom experience in which the students are co-participants in a learning community at whose center is the creation of a culture of competence in analysis and argument. And I say that I'm not really interested in hearing people's opinions, that I'm not doing them any service by allowing them to engage performatively, right, in statements about their personal identity, in statements about their personal ideology, right? That my job in the classroom is, to the best of my ability, to create a space in which students are willing to have difficult conversations that involve advancing and defending with evidence, right, positions about the materials that we're reading that day. And, you know, that varies. Sometimes it's an appellate court opinion, but in the human rights class, you know, last week and the week before, we read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, and then we read the district court and the Supreme Court opinions by the Israeli courts in the Eichmann case, and we watched a film about the Eichmann case that used archival footage from the trial. And so there are many different spaces for the students to make different kinds of arguments about different kinds of material, to engage in different kinds of analysis, and to explore different methods of interpretation. But my job is to hold that space as a forum for cultivating a certain, I'll use a human rights term, capability, right? And competence in analysis, interpretation, and argument, which means we can talk about anything, right? But the terms of the discourse are governed by a shared commitment to a mode of discourse that is rigorous, right? And which is willing to give an account of itself and the positions that people are advancing, right? That is defended on the basis of and can be challenged on the basis of claims about facts, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, not everybody does that. Not everybody can do that. But I think there's a value to saying, you know, this is a kind of space in which the kind of conversation, if the university is a conversation or a cluster of conversations, the conversation we have in this space of the university is different than the kind of conversation you're going to have, you know, in the dining room or in the halls or in the student lounge or the like. And I think that sense of the separate spheres in which different kinds of conversation can take place is faithful to the idea of pluralism, right? And to the notion that there's no one way to talk about anything, right? But at the same time, understands that there is a value and an integrity to being disciplined, right? And that's why we call it a discipline. Being disciplined about the way we engage in the common enterprise of learning in concert, right?
Thank you. So I would like to open it up to questions for our last 20 minutes. And the way we'll do it is if you have a question and you'd like to unmute your mic and speak, we'd love to hear your voice. So you can just raise your hand and we can call on you. If you prefer to put a question in the chat, we can do that. And I'm happy to just read the question for you. And we'll go back and forth between raising hands and the chat. And let's see. So while we're waiting, we already have a question in the chat, so I can read that. So this is from Derek. He says, Dr. Thomas, if I understand you correctly, you're arguing that despite the increasing pressure on the human rights community due to Trumpism and racial violence in the Black community, our community should not pivot from the pedagogy and practice we've brought to the classroom in the years leading up to these moments. What type of direction are you concerned about the community shifting towards? So if you want to take that.
Well, I see, and I understand that the law school is a specific location.
Mm-hmm.
I teach at university law school, at a research university law school. And so I understand my job to be contributing with my colleagues to the preparation of and education of students who are going to enter, most of whom are going to enter the profession as practicing lawyers. At the same time, for me, given its reliance on techniques of analysis, of interpretation, of argument, of reasoning, that really are continuous with what many of the students have experienced as undergraduates, I also see legal education as a continuation of liberal arts education. Right? And I think my emphasis on the humanism, the essential humanism of the enterprise is expressive of that vision. And so, like I said earlier, I'm not saying that any issue is off the table, right? We discuss the Eichmann case, but we also discuss the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. We read about the law and politics of the veil and ban on burqas, religious and gender justice. But this year we're also doing a unit on Black Lives Matter, right? Because one of the framing languages of the movement for Black lives is human rights. Indeed, it understands itself not as a civil rights movement, but as a human rights movement. But in discussing those materials, I'm not intending to relax the requirement of rigor or the other regulative, intellectual, and ethical ideals that are structuring principles and practices for the rest of the seminar. So my answer to your question is, I think recognizing and bringing these issues that are of public importance in the field of human rights into the classroom is important. But I think it can and should be done in a way that is faithful to the intellectual enterprise.
If I could,
as I understand it, right? As I understand it.
If I could just add to that, I mean, I fully agree, and I teach in a very different space. I think about pedagogy both as content, but also as the process of learning. And so as I think about, I teaching undergraduates from intro human rights classes to upper level senior capstones on human rights advocacy, even for those students, for some of those students, this is their first presidential election, so that they're voting in. And so this is a particularly unique sort of age group, right? And so it is in some ways important, I think, to pivot content, but that doesn't mean pivoting the process of learning, perhaps, which is, I think, in part, maybe, if I'm understanding correctly, Professor Thomas's notion here, and this idea that even in my classroom, we think about many sources of knowledge, right? And even one's experiences is a source of knowledge and we can learn from, but I'm real careful, I take great care to help students think about sharing a personal experience that we can learn from and your opinion, right? Which your opinion may emerge from your experience, but let's talk about your experience as a source of knowledge rather than just the opinion or that sort of performative piece. But so I think as we think about pedagogy, sort of thinking about both content and the process of learning, and sort of our approach in the kinds of classrooms we create and the expectations and the rigor that we have are really, really critical.
Mhm.
Thank you both. Shelley Inglis, do you want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Sandra, thanks. Yes, fascinating conversation, particularly about how to teach human rights at different levels and in different disciplines, and how we structure it. Just going back to the question at hand, it's a thought exercise, but I'm interested in the thought exercise of how we pivot or how we not pivot, and what we're signaling there if we have a sustained or longer period of disruption and instability and lack of knowledge of the results of the elections, and what the panelists think that involves. Because there's one thing to have a writing exercise the day after, a few days after. It's another thing to deal with ongoing and significant disruption, as we've seen with coronavirus, and instability, and that layered on top of the instability and disruption that we're experiencing now, seems to me to create a need as educators for us to think through, what does civic engagement look like beyond the vote, beyond poll watching, beyond all the things we're telling our students, if we have a prolonged period of instability and unclarity about the results of this election?
That's a great question. It's not as though there aren't precedents. I remember the three decisions, I think they were three, the three separate decisions from the Supreme Court in 2000 in Bush versus Gore.
Me too.
And the protracted period in which, it wasn't clear who had actually won the presidential election. So I think here of Michel Foucault's idea of the politics of discomfort, right? And the ways in which we can use that discomfort as a resource to reflect on what Foucault calls power knowledge, right? And the ways in which what we possibly will not know for several weeks is both a consequence and a cause that has to do with power and with the nature of what we call our democracy and the stresses on it in the current moment. And then I think in human rights in particular, this would be a really wonderful opportunity to direct the students' attention outward, right? Mm-hmm. To talk from a global perspective mm-hmm. about the challenges that we are experiencing and how perhaps those challenges offer both an intellectual and an empathic connection to citizens in other countries in which these sorts of moments are baked into their experience of the political process and of themselves as citizens. So, I mean, I really do think that going comparative and global in the classroom is perhaps going to be one of the most valuable undertakings that we can offer to our students if heaven forbid, we find ourselves in a protracted and prolonged period of uncertainty about the outcome of the presidential election.
Natalie or Rachel, do you want?
Would you like to comment, Rachel? I'm happy to, but.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I agree so much with all of that. And I think the only thing I would add is that students tend to want to know, what can I do? And that will be unclear in a situation of prolonged confusion and instability. So it seems as if it could be an opportunity for a heightened examination of the political process surrounding the political process as it's unfolding. So I think the inner workings of the branches of government as it concerns elections and really anything tends to be somewhat mysterious, I think, to many students, to many people. And jumping on what will be their likely fierce curiosity about what is permissible, how things are supposed to proceed, what is being followed, what is not, what the recourses are for what is not being followed. Capitalizing on that need to know for a deep dive into democratic processes that are and are not being followed might be necessary and valuable.
So I think, and then this is, again, is very context specific to where I teach, but I think one of the things that I think about in regards to Shelley's really important question is, for us and for many universities across the country, we will have the election, and at the sort of late November timeframe, most students will move home, right? And they will spend the remainder of their time at home, whatever that is for them, as many campuses are trying to eliminate that come back to university and not bringing students back until January. And so I think about what that's going to mean for students if we're in a situation of sort of really protracted uncertainty, perhaps even volatile situations, what that means to go home to places where perhaps their political views differ sharply from their parents, which I know is the case for many of my own students personally. And so one of the things that I thought about as I thought in terms of more than just a day after the election, but weeks after the election, what could students do? I actually went back to Sirota Kargas, who I think is on the call, and her three-part framework for thinking about human rights education. And I thought about, what would it mean to push students to research, think, write about, work on, the following questions. What did we learn about human rights over the course of the election? And what are we learning about human rights and the intersection of rule of law and the judicial process, freedom of expression, all of those things, right? So that's one. What do we learn about human rights? Secondly, how can we work for human rights in the coming weeks and months and years? Like, what organizations have inspired you? Where could you get involved in the long term, right? Like thinking more in terms of sort of the longer commitment. And then lastly, and I think this is actually the most important for students, particularly as they think about transitioning home, is asking students how they will allow human rights to work through them in their day-to-day interactions with friends and peers and parents and professors and whoever else, in terms of what sort of attitudes and beliefs and behaviors do we want to channel and reflect that embody human rights. I mean, for me, I draw a lot from feminist pedagogy, but I think about, embracing difference and difficult conversation, taking seriously our multiple and intersectional identities, and really, this goes back to Professor Thomas's idea of being both empathetic and intellectual in our everyday interactions. And so I think that framework is actually really useful. So thanks, Sirota, you're here. Shout out.
I mean, it's really interesting. Human rights is one of the few areas of inquiry and study where we are literally enacting what our subject is about as we're doing it, right?
Absolutely.
Right? We're doing what we're studying, right? If we're doing it well, right?
Thank you. So we have one more question, and then maybe if anyone wants to make some final brief remarks. This is for Kendall. I'd love to know if you have any specific recommendations for bringing in global comparisons if the election results are in disarray for any reason.
I'm not a comparative or domestic election law person for that matter. So I can't give you any specific instances, but I would recommend simply looking in the newspapers. Because, you know, this week there are at least a couple of countries in Africa where, in violation of the terms of the Constitution, the incumbent president is seeking an additional term, right? So I would imagine that it would not be that difficult to find some examples of crisis moments in electoral politics that will offer a platform for comparative analysis and conversation.
Thank you. Let me share this one last question. In the case of not getting election results right away, does anyone know of a source of news or information for reliable and nonpartisan information where we can direct students who want to know what's going on? Good question. Anybody wants to share, you could put it in the chat, or does anyone have an idea? This might need some research and follow-up.
I would also love to hear suggestions. I would also just add, while people are thinking about it, that I think in general, leading students to analyze framing in news media, not necessarily as a delegitimizing force of that media, but in order to help them interpret every source that they come across. Now, I'm not saying all media is biased, therefore it's hopeless, but I think it will be perhaps useful at any moment, but particularly now, to help students look at the way headlines are framed about the same topic in different papers and different news sources, and develop, depending upon the course, skills in that kind of frame analysis as they go and read whatever they're going to read on their social media feeds.
Yeah, I don't remember the name of it, but there is a website where they show you how biased and unbiased they think news sources and whether it's left-leaning or right-leaning. I don't know if anybody remembers the name of that site, but I'm sure you could Google it and find it. So that one may be helpful. So we are at 2 o'clock, so maybe I'll ask the panelists if you have any last brief remarks before I turn it over to Christina to close us out. Okay.
No, I just wish you all luck, everyone in this space. Best wishes in the coming weeks.
Well, thank you so much. Please give our panelists a virtual round of applause for coming and sharing their wisdom with us. And thanks to all of you for listening. I'm sure you all had a lot of wisdom that we didn't get to hear, but we don't want to zoom you out by going too long. So this really was a wonderful conversation. We really appreciate it. And now I will turn it over to Christina.
Great, thank you, Sandra. I want to thank you, and I want to thank our panelists for such an interesting discussion, and all of you for joining us today. Both the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia, as well as the University and College Consortium for Human Rights Education, really work to create space to have these dialogue and discussions, and I'm sure we're gonna need to have many more. So if you have thoughts or ideas about specific discussions you wanna have, we'd encourage you to contact us either at ishr@columbia.edu or ucchre@gmail.com. And I'd especially encourage folks in the next month or so to go to our new ucchre.org website. We're gonna have lots of wonderful resources and tools, including learning activities and syllabi. So thank you all again. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.
Bye.
all.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.